It's now time to go into our next speaker, who is Grant Jenkins, who's an associate professor of English and creative writing, and he teaches contemporary literature, theory, and creative writing here at TU. He is the author of Poetic Obligation, Ethics in Experimental American Poetry after 1945, and the manuscript under consideration, Otherwise Ethics in African American Poetry after the Civil Rights Movement, and has published 2 books of poetry, Joy of God and Other Series, and Morphs with Cheryl Pallant. His novel, Ivory Tower, was published in 2020 by Atmosphere Press. Professor Jenkins, in his talk, will preview his upcoming course, The Poetics of Video Games, and also consider how this and other courses in creative writing can help improve your game design and game writing. So we'll go to his talk now.
Hi, welcome everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Akram Tagavi Burris for inviting me to speak, and also for the wonderful work that she's done to bring this conference together to TU and to make it available to everyone online. I'm very happy to be here. I myself am a gamer. My sons are gamers, and it's a pleasure for me to connect my 2 worlds. Professional life as a literature and creative writing professor, and my hobby and interest in gaming. And I've been wanting to teach a class like the Poetics of Video Games, which I'll talk about in a minute, for a long time. And I think there's going to be lots of room in the future in TU for making video games a much more integral part of our creative writing program. Okay, so here are the questions that I will try to answer today. First of all, is what is my summer course? It's called The Poetics of Video Games. What's it all about? And I think the major question would be, what does poetics mean? You may know what video games means, but what does poetics mean? I'll talk about that. I'll also talk about how poetics is relevant to the art of video game design, as well as answer the question, how can creative writing courses help your game design education? And then hopefully there'll be time at the end if you have any questions about what I've been talking about. Okay, so first let me read the description for my course, English 2003, The Poetics of Video Games. You can see there's an image here from one of my favorite games, Halo 2. I love the entire Halo series up until Halo 4. We can talk about why Halo 4 is not so good later. And I think it really does come down to storytelling and its poetics, but we can get to that some other time. So 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote his Poetics in order to understand the nature and practice of drama. In this course, we will do the same thing for a more recent art form, video games. Our task, like the philosophers, will be to explore the meaning, tropes, types, history, and methods of telling stories through interactive digital media. Yes, we will be playing lots of video games in this course, and we will also produce various writing projects in different media to answer our question, how and what do video games mean? And it also fills a Block 1 requirement in the Tulsa curriculum. So if you still need a Block 1, this is a perfect class for you. And this will be taught, let me give you the deets in a second, taught this summer. Here's what we'll be doing and covering in this class, okay? We'll be defining these various terms. Obviously, I mentioned we'll be defining poetics, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we'll also be talking about what is a game, what is a video game, and going in depth and what's the terminology we'd be using to create this encyclopedic understanding of video games. We'll be talking about the parts and elements of video games. And really kind of, I think the heart and meat of this course will be to talk about structure of video games, the tropes that video games often use, and the styles of video games. And I think particularly of interest to me is like classifying types of video games and the different genres. I don't think there's a definitive understanding of the vast quantity of video games. We'll try our hand at a taxonomy of video games and see what we can come up with. And we'll be talking about the history of video games. Many of you probably know more about the history of video games than I do. And a lot of the topics we'll be doing in this class will be pooling our knowledge, sharing it, and disseminating it through various digital media as well. And I'd also like to talk about the business ecosystem. I mean, I think a lot of us think of video games as a hobby, but it's also a business and it's also a career opportunity, particularly for those of you who are creatives and may have never have thought of getting into video game design. And then we'll be talking about the cultural, political, and psychological context to video games that will help us understand what they mean, why they're important to people, what the impacts are on people of video games. I mean, it's one of the, I think the biggest topics is, are video games dangerous to people or not? You know, we'll be talking about various things like that. It's all integral to understanding what video games mean. And we'll be, as I said, we'll be pooling our knowledge and really creating a kind of encyclopedia of video games throughout the term. Usually when I pitch a course to students, they want to know what kind of work we'll be doing. So these are the deliverables we'll be producing as a course. And they're not just like regular English papers. I want everyone to know that off the bat. I'll be asking you to write personal narrative blogs, right? I'd like to hear what video games you're playing, to hear what you think of them. I always learn about new games by talking to people about what they're playing and what they think of them. And to give sort of a more broader view of why you should play a video game or what are its strengths and weaknesses. In reviews, I'm sure a lot of you watch reviews on YouTube or write them yourself, and I want to take advantage of that, your knowledge of that genre, and we'll create some of those as well. We'll be building a wiki on video games for the course, covering the various topics that we'll be covering that I showed you on the last slide. And I'd like to do a sort of visual timeline of the history of video games, something that is attractive that you can just get in a glance, that sort of summarizes and maybe is interactive and allows people to click on various aspects of the history that they want to know more. Again, this is something we will decide together as a class. And yeah, we'll do a sort of more typical researched article. And I say article because I'd like you to think of a real world application or a place you might actually submit this critical article about a relevant issue. They're very excellent journals, online zines that publish critical articles about the meaning of video games. And so I want you to think beyond the course in terms of your audience being someone other than your professor. And last but not least, I'd like to get a creative proposal from you about a potential video game. It won't be a long document, but I don't know if you are like me thinking about what would the perfect video game be that I would like to play. And I'd sort of like to just everyone to sort of imagine that perfect video game and to pitch it to the rest of the course. And then to end the semester, you will write self-evaluation and evaluation of your peers as you'll be working together in small groups. And you'll be assessing your performance in the class and giving yourself a grade. I've been asking my students to grade their own work in courses for almost 2 decades now. And one of the advantages of that is, first of all, students are honest. And I appreciate the honesty that students display in assessing what kind of work that they've done. And there's also something that a professor cannot measure, and that's how much time and effort you spend on a class. And these kinds of reports will allow you to explain to me in detail how much engagement you've given this class. So these are the details about the course. As I said, it's this summer, and it'll meet every day from 10:20 to noon. It's kind of an odd start time. But we'll be beginning May 23rd, and it'll run for a month till June 24th. It'll be in Chapman Hall. If you've never been in Chapman Hall, it's located on the U. It's one of the ugly buildings, I'd say. It will be mostly discussion, formatted class with some lecture by me, and then, as I mentioned, you'll be working in groups to produce some of the documents that we talked about earlier. And there are seats still open. So check it out, talk to your advisor, and enroll for this summer course. Okay, that's the course. Now let's take a little bit step backwards and get a broader view of some of these ideas and talk about what a poetics is. I mean, this is the sort of model that I'll be using for this course, so I want everyone to understand what it might mean and why it might be useful to those of you who are studying, designing, and making video games. So the word poetics comes from the Greek word poetikos, which means, of course, pertaining to poetry, but it also means creative or productive. And in its verb form, it means to make or making. So Aristotle wrote a theory of literature called Poetics. And yes, it's about poetry, in particular the poetic form that was most prevalent in the 4th century BC when Aristotle was around, and that is drama, plays. And this book, Poetics, is a study of the parts of drama and how they work together for larger effects, okay? So there's a method involved in this Poetics. And so using Aristotle's method, his approach, we can make a poetics of anything that humans make. You can do a poetics of television. You could do a poetics of sculpture, a poetics of any kind of craft, any kind of making. We'll be applying it to video games. Okay, so how is poetics relevant to game design? I'll try to give you a brief answer to that course today, to that question. Obviously, the course will be the larger answer, so I encourage you to sign up and get the in-depth answer to that. But I'll try to tease you a little bit here with some possible answers. First of all, it seems obvious, but video games are made. They're created, and they're created through creativity. Right? This is really where the connection between video game design and creative writing overlaps. And creative making, no matter what you're making, is a process that's governed by rules, goals, and values. We'll be talking about what those rules, goals, and values are in video games. And particularly to think about developing your own goals, being able to articulate your own values and how those might shape your gaming design as you move forward. People, of course, make video games for different reasons, using different elements and strategies. It's one of the beautiful things about the art of video games is there's just so many different types of games that have so many different purposes, and it's not just for entertainment. I think I'm preaching to the choir when I say that to you all, that it's not just about mindless entertainment, which is the bad rap that video games get. But I think it's important to point out that there's more reasons than their entertainment value that the video game industry is now larger than all of Hollywood filmmaking, right? It's been that way for over a decade. And thinking about a poetics of video games gives it the status of serious art. Right? Film used to be thought of like video games are today as a kind of waste of time, mindless entertainment, not having anything meaningful to say about human existence. And now there are film studies programs. You can get a graduate degree in film studies. And I think video games deserve the same kind of serious treatment. And ultimately, a comprehensive knowledge of your art will help you make better art. I know it sounds obvious. And you don't have to have knowledge of like the history, the meaning of your art form to make art. Some people just prefer to do. But I do believe that having a sort of poetic mindset about video games will help you think deeper about what you're doing and therefore make better products. Okay. My computer is stuck right here. All right, here we go. All right, so the practical question. I imagine a lot of you are computer science majors, engineers. You have very practical minds, and you want to know, well, how is this going to help me? How can creative writing in general help your game design? So I'm going to make a pitch for not just my summer course, but for creative writing courses in general as something that will help you in your quest to become a game designer. So all time-based art forms have specific requirements and rules, and some of them are in common, right? And when we say time-based art, we mean anything, any kind of art form folds through time, right? That unfolds over time. We're not talking specifically, we're not talking about things like painting where you can sort of perceive it in one glance, in a moment, right? We're talking about something that takes time to go through it. So in that way, video games are more like films, they're more like novels, they're more like symphonies than they are like painting, sculpture, and other sort of non-time-based art forms. Another thing about video games is that they take practice to make, right? And creative writing can give you the time and space to practice your creativity, to practice making, to practice working in time-based art forms. I tell my students, I say, this might be the last chance that you just have free time in your schedule for creativity, for writing poems, for writing stories. I don't know if any of my students will ever do that again. And it really is a privilege and a pleasure to just have a course that says, okay, now I'm going to spend time thinking about my time-based art form, in this sense, video games. Creative writing courses emphasize the importance of storytelling structure, from fiction to TV writing to other classes that we offer in screenplay and other narrative-based forms. You'll learn things about how to tell a story, when certain things happen in a story, the order of parts of a story, and how they work together to create an effective and meaningful story. I don't know about you guys, but my favorite kind of video game is, a narrative video game that takes me on a journey through a story with characters. And because those are elements that video games share with, say, fiction writing, it's going to help you to take fiction writing to produce good stories for your video games. Another thing that creative writing can do to help you with your game design is that literature delves into human nature, right? That literature does that through character and dialogue, right? Through setting, through creating a world, right? And there's a lot lower stakes in doing that on your own in a story, right? Where it's really essentially you and your keyboard and the word processing program that you use. Doesn't take a lot of investment as opposed to a video game, which might take a lot more time, a collaborative effort, require investment and money to produce. So practicing your storytelling in a low stakes arena like writing a short story can help you practice those kinds of skills that you'll then take to what I would think of as a more high stakes arena of video game design. I also believe that knowing the social and political context of your art will strengthen it. What are humans in our day and time concerned about? What are the issues that people get riled up about? What matters to people today? If you're in touch with the issues that are facing the world through current events, through contemporary debates, then your art will be more in touch with what people care about at that time. Okay? And that's something we get into when we talk about creative writing or literature. I think creative writers think first, like, I'm writing a story that will change the world. I mean, students come in with that mentality. And I believe that video game designers should have that kind of mentality too, and that creative writing can help you sort of develop that mindset that your game can have an impact and say something about the issues that are animating the world and that are what we are concerned about right now. I would also say that language-focused art forms like poetry can improve other aspects of your game design. Vocabulary, your use of imagery, and I'm not just talking about visual imagery. Video games are often very visual, right? They require sight, but also to use other senses, right, in your game design. And to think about your sentence style, and just to solve creative problems through words gives practice that I think is very transportable into video game design. So I would even encourage all of you who are gamers who want to make games to take poetry classes. I know that just sounds like the furthest thing apart, but I really believe that learning sort of the art of language will help you create better, more interesting worlds, more interesting characters, better dialogue, increase your vocabulary and your sort of insight into human nature. Okay, so that's my pitch for the usefulness of taking creative writing. And so I hope that you might challenge me on that or ask me questions about that, because I definitely am game for talking more about why computer science majors, gaming designers should take creative writing. So we have some time, I suppose, for questions if anyone has any. So the question is, when else will the course be offered? Will it be offered in the future if you can't take the summer version this summer? And my hope is yes. So the next move will be to make this course a permanent course in the English and Creative Writing department. I'm not certain how often it will be offered. But I do know that there are several of my colleagues in the English department who are gamers who include video games in their teaching of literature and other courses. So I have high hopes that it will be offered regularly. I would say probably not till next year or the year after that, just to be realistic. We have so much to teach. Yeah, so the question is my thoughts on the interactivity of video games and how that affects the storytelling. I never really thought about it until I played the game Mass Effect. I don't know if any of you have ever played Mass Effect, but I don't think it's the only video game that does this, but it really goes into depth to utilize the interactivity of video games in storytelling by giving you different dialogue options. So as you play, I think we would call that a an RPG, right? You're playing the role playing as the intrepid hero, and you're placed in these situations where you interact with other characters and there's conversations. I think one of my favorite part of the Mass Effect trilogy is the sort of the dialogue and the character development. And so you can respond differently as characters ask you questions or you have to make decisions. And it really creates a superbly complex tree. So you think of narrative in a film, you mentioned film and TV, that the narrative is linear, right? There's one story. But when you give a plot point, you give your character choices, then you suddenly have a multilinear storytelling. And one of the beautiful things about Mass Effect and games like that that do give the gamer an option, different options at various points in the narrative, is they have impacts down the line in the narrative, right? And that's just, to me, that's so provocative, and it opens up so many possibilities for storytelling. And that kind of complexity of trying to, as a writer, to think about all the possibilities and not just what they'll lead to in the next step or two, but in the next game, what impacts those choices at key moments in the previous couple of games will do. I mean, the choices you make in Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 2 determine how things are going to turn out in Mass Effect 3. I don't think really one person can keep all that in their head. I mean, this requires a team of writers and creatives to work through that so it makes sense, right? I think it requires new technologies to keep track of that kind of storytelling and how complex it can get. But I think we're just getting to the beginning of that. I mean, I can imagine, as you probably can even more because you guys know more about gaming and computers than I do, and I can imagine how AI will be so essential to the future of this kind of storytelling, and I think that's incredibly exciting. What if Pride and Prejudice, or what if Great Expectations, or what if The Great Gatsby talked back to you? I mean, that is... I don't know, you just put your favorite novel in that, in that blank there. What if you could go into your favorite novel and live in that world? I mean, the possibilities are endless, and I think computers and digital technologies really are about to take storytelling to the next level. I tease my students and say, one of these days there'll be holodeck writers, because I'm a Star Trek fan, as I hope a lot of you are, right? And I do really hope that we have the technology today to walk into a room like this, but it becomes any world that you want. I think that to me is the apotheosis of storytelling. And we are getting closer and closer to that as computing leaps ahead. And we have the kind of computing power that would allow you to a computer to respond to any kind of unpredictable human choice, which is what storytelling is about. It's about characters making choices, right? So a great question, by the way. Thank you. Yes, in the back there. Yeah, so the question is, how do you stay original when you get so deep and involved in the tradition, right? I have a lot of students who are like, I don't read because I want to stay original. And so it doesn't make sense in the gaming context, I don't think, because I'd be like, what, you're going to stop playing video games? In creative writing, this is why when you take creative writing, your professors are going to ask you to read, okay? Because we see reading as essential to being able to write. All the great writers, no matter who you think about, from Toni Morrison to William Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Stein, all of those great writers that maybe you've taken in classes, they all knew their traditions inside and out. They were readers, they knew other writers, they talked about writing, they just, you hear that thing about 10,000 hours, you got to do something for 10,000 hours to master it or whatever. I mean, they all put in 10,000 plus, right? And it's, with storytelling, I think there's also a particular aspect to it. In my courses on fiction, I'm a true believer there are really only about 7, maybe 12 different stories that humans have told through the history of humanity. You know, I mean, just think of some of your favorite movies. I don't know, something like Star Wars. The original Star Wars, A New Hope, is a plot basically called Overcoming the Monster, right? The trilogy is about Luke Skywalker overcoming the dark side of the Force, liberating his father from it, right? And there are many iterations of that story, right? The story of A Voyage and Return, the Odyssey, essentially, gets told again and again through the history of literature. And so the creative part of storytelling, and I think this is true of video games. I mentioned Mass Effect. Clearly that's overcoming the monster if you've played Mass Effect. Some of the most horrifying, terrifying monsters ever imagined, I think, in literature. You know, that's what that basic story is. But what makes a story interesting isn't the plot. It's the variations on it. The world changes, you know? A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Boom. Suddenly that's what makes this same story we've heard over and over again of overcoming the monster different, right? Character. Character is really also, I think, probably the most dynamic part of storytelling, and is the most variable way a writer can intervene in that same old plot, is to put different kinds of people in there. Because different kinds of people react differently to particular situations, right? And that's where, and this is what creative writing is all about, I think, is telling that same old story but different. That's a very common screenwriting saying from Hollywood screenwriters. They say it's the same story but different. Like Hollywood producers want that kind of reliability. Yeah, remind me of what film it is. It's like Ferris Bueller's Day Off meets blank, but they want to know why it's different, because the sameness makes people comfortable. Oh yeah, I kind of know this story, and it's soothing to hear the same story again. That's why kids want to hear bedtime stories over and over again, because there's something soothing in the familiarity of the story of, you know, Little Red Riding Hood going into the forest and overcoming the monster, right? But we also want variation, because we're human. We get bored with stuff. Right? So it's always that balance between the familiar and the new that is what moves storytelling forward. And I think video games need that. And in fact, I would say like AAA titles of video games right now are suffering from this stagnation because they haven't realized that they really need to tell the same stories over and differently. And I think, you know, that's a problem I'd like to see overcome. You know, and I think the writers are really going to be doing it, and the designers who think about the way the story is going to be told. I mean, not all video games obviously are narrative, but they often have some sort of arc or structure to them. Even Mario has to go through increasingly harder and harder levels and fight harder and harder bosses. I mean, that's essentially the story. You know, that's its story. It's overcoming the monster. Great question. There were some other hands.
Before you mentioned about like how the computer programmers or like more in the CS area of like video games, you mentioned that like even they should take some kind of could you elaborate on the reasons why?
Yeah, let me go back to that slide. I mean, I think it's obviously complicated, and I feel like they're like if we get into like different technical jobs of, you know, I mean, God, how many people worked on Mass Effect? I mean, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands, of people working on that video game. So I'm not sure I could answer like if your job is to do textures in a video game, for example, like do you need to know storytelling? I don't know, maybe, because really that's about setting, right? How do you create a setting that is going to heighten the drama of a particular game, add to its tone? Like these are all creative writing words, like tone, setting, right? I mean, this is what Aristotle talks about in the Poetics, to be honest. And video gamers are still thinking about this, and like the different kinds of textures, the different colors, the mood, the sort of lighting. Honestly, I don't know that much about the whole graphic aspect and how to make them. But I do know when a game really nails, you know, the tone through the visual design, right? That it just adds to it. And in fact, I mean, I love video games where the world becomes almost like a character. I'm trying to think. I just replayed Batman Arkham Asylum just recently. You know, one of the reasons why I love that game is because the Arkham Asylum map is like a character. It changes over the course of the game. And that just adds so much to the pleasure and the storytelling, I think, as Batman is trying to overcome the monsters, multiple monsters, right? The island itself that he's on becomes a monster that he has to overcome and subdue, right? So all the sort of people who are involved in creating that, how that island feels in terms of its dimensions, its color, the interactivity with like the various obstacles you know, that Batman has to get through to get around the island. Like, you know, everyone's contributing to that in various ways. And if they know sort of like how their little part fits into the whole and how this is about what part of the story they're involved with, I think it can help them advance their art and to think of new ways that would make a game player's experience the story even more viscerally. Right?
I was wondering about how you think that like the idea of games as more of a sport can intertwine with the more poetic elements of it, like as something that's like or
Right.
how does that sort of change the dynamic in your other art forms?
So the question is, if you think of games as sport, you know, how does that change, or how would this be relevant to these forms? I mean, obviously, I'm sort of focusing on storytelling, but that's not the only aspect. I mean, so when you say sport, like, do you don't just mean like video games that happen to be about sports, like FIFA, whatever. You're thinking of gaming as an activity that's more like a sport rather than. I mean, I still think games are, in a way, they're time-based art forms. God, you know, I mean, one of the reasons I'm a sports fan too. One of the reasons why I love sports, particularly basketball, you know, although the other sports from American football to soccer, like, they're beautiful. They have aesthetics, like, you know. But I think like basketball, the way the figures move through this very limited space, which is the setting, the world, and anyone who follows sports knows that there's drama. I'm sure that there's drama in the whole e-game world too. I'm sure you have your favorite, you know, competitive professional gamers, and you follow their careers and their characters in this world. Like, I don't think that you can separate any kind of like time-based sport and art form. I think they're very similar and have like a lot of overlaps. And even if you're designing a game that's based on a sport, say Madden, like, there are characters. Like, the announcers in Madden add to the drama by their dialogue and what they say about the game. You know, the reactions the players have. Each player has its own stats, like almost like aspects of a character, right? And also they do certain things that are kind of extracurricular to the game, like they might get a foul or something, you know, and then there's reactions by the coaches. So, like, you know, I think we love sports because they're dramatic, right? and we can talk about that in the same terms that we talk about poetics, I think, to understand how even the most, what we think of the furthest thing away from literature, like sports, it's still very, very literary and aesthetic and artistic. You guys have asked some great questions. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the chance to talk. Come into my world and learn a little bit more about creative writing and the literary, and because I spend a lot of time in your world, I have to say.